Hello and welcome to episode number 27 of Performing Labor. My name is Rob Simonds, and I am your host. This podcast features interviews with accomplished performing musicians who are doing interesting and creative work from within performing arts institutions and outside of them. Before I get started with the quick intro to this episode, I want to apologize both to the audience and to my guest for my slowness in getting this episode out. We recorded this a number of weeks ago, but ironically, the combination of a couple of things that we talked about in this interview, most notably the increasing capacity of musicians to produce online concerts and my own steps towards a career beyond being a full-time performer, both of those things unexpectedly surged in the intervening time between the recording and this publishing. So again, apologies for that. And with that out of the way, my guest this month has created one of the most interesting careers of anyone I know. Ben Sollee is a cellist, singer-songwriter, composer, improviser, activist, and something of a public figure in his native Kentucky and beyond. He's been a working musician since he was in high school, and then went on to balance the sometimes conflicting demands of touring and recording against the values and demands of a traditional higher ed music school performance program. Ben has developed a solo career with many dimensions into something of an indie juggernaut. As a composer, he's written for ballets, documentary and film scores, and most recently, Robin Wright's directorial debut, the movie Land, where he collaborated with the string trio Time for Three. No Depression magazine has described the project Ben Sollee and Kentucky native as, quote, "The beauty of the album lies in its adventurous musical spirit, always challenging us and carrying us on a sonic journey that awakens our curiosity, heightens our senses, and opens doors onto bright, undiscovered musical vistas." Reviewing a live performance, the New York Times said, "Mr. Sollee evoked the euphoria of finding a comfortable groove while whizzing down the road. Joy peeked through the music like rays of sunshine in the Kentucky woods." I know that I was not alone amidst my classical music circles and was captivated by Ben's music and musicianship. And I know that that connection that we felt to his work went beyond the common denominator of the cello. He has an instrumental approach that classical music players are drawn to for sure, but it's that it's combined with an authenticity and soulfulness. There's an obvious high level of craft and virtuosity, but there's also a directness that many of us are drawn to. The British author Sarah Bakewell, in her book about the French Renaissance philosopher Michel de Montaigne, describes how, in the 16th century, he was one of the first to figure out how to write a perennial international bestseller. She said his work combined, quote, "the perfect commercial combination, startling originality, and easy classification." And that's what Ben's music is for me. When my radar was first dialed up for possible collaborations between classical institutions and ascendant, independent, and Americana musicians, Ben was one of the first people that I approached. With the Downtown Chamber Series and the Musical Instrument Museum in Phoenix, we presented a concert with Ben and a small ensemble. And then later, coincidentally, I joined the Louisville Orchestra in Kentucky, where we did a couple of small projects and a few really big ones with the full orchestra, all of which rank as some of my very favorite performance memories. And I'll put a few links to those in the show notes. In talking with him for the first time in a few years, I learned a number of things about his journey, but I also took away quite a bit about going forward. Of particular resonance for me were his thoughts on navigating the so-called reputation economy with a values-forward approach, and the need to, as he puts it, communicate, identify, and drive impact. There's both a loftiness and a practicality to that, both thinking big about particular problems and also getting your own house in order. Being a responsive artist or institution, and also leading by example. I think it's analogous to what's been said about democratic institutions, that they must be both servant and tutor. And to wrap up along those lines, I want to close with a few sentences from John W. Garner, who wrote this way back in 1970 in an America facing pretty similar circumstances to the ones that we're facing now. And I think they underscore Ben's points of community building, being values-forward artists and institutions, and also having a sober pragmatism. Garner wrote, quote, "We have in the tradition of this nation a well-tested framework of values: justice, liberty, equality of opportunity, the worth and dignity of the individual, brotherhood, and individual responsibility. These are all supremely compatible with social renewal. Our problem is not to find better values, but to be faithful to those we profess. Such values cannot be said to be alive unless they live in the acts of men." The security and sense of well-being of the individual is directly affected by the extent to which he believes that his society furthers values that to him seem worthy. He wants to believe in his institutions. He doesn't need to believe that society is perfectly just. He just needs to believe that it strives for justice. Please enjoy this interview with Ben Sollee. Ben Sollee, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So I was recently reading an article with a guy named Michael Bobbitt, who is the new executive director of the Massachusetts Cultural Council. And he was talking about how with all the cross-cutting crises we have in this country and abroad, that artists might be the people most likely to, in his words, imagine the world differently. And when I heard that, I thought of you. And I thought of your career and all the ways you've approached this profession a little differently, from bicycle tours to combining old and new forms to tackling political and environmental issues. And at the core of all that is storytelling. It's a part of your songwriting, of course, but it's also part of your live show. And combining music and drama, and maybe more specifically, combining music and narrative. And I think that's embodied in soundtracks and for movies and documentaries. So I'm wondering how you got started down that road. Was that something that you sought out, or is it one thing where opening one door opened many others?
Looking way back into high school, I started performing on a radio show called Woodsong's Old Time Radio Hour. As a young feller, I volunteered as part of the tech crew for that, as well as I ended up playing in the stage band, the Folk Boy Orchestra with Michael Jonathan. And, you know, the whole thing was kind of a Coen Brothers Mighty Wind sort of feeling environment. But it was a tremendous, place to be steeped in performing arts, as well as storytelling, as well as just like the working musician. We had folks come through the show, 2 artists every week, and I played on some 200 broadcasts. And, saw and heard the story of Roger McGuinn, who wrote the song, The World Turns, Turn, Turn, Turn. Mm-hmm. And Sweet Honey in the Rock, and Odetta, and Ralph Stanley, and Edgar Meyer, and Chris Steele as a young fella, like all these folks, and they would all come, and there'd be the conversation on stage, but there'd also be the conversation backstage. And I think that's where I kind of got the idea that if you're going to do this music career thing, there's so many unknowns, you might as well do it the way that represents your values. And growing up in Kentucky, I had, both my parents were musicians. They didn't do it professionally, but they were both, my mom sang, my dad played guitar. My grandfather, Elvis, was a farmer, Baptist preacher, postman, coal miner. And I grew up spending a lot of time on the land. And I also just had a lot of interests as a performer. I spent time doing ballet and dance and, all these different things. So I've always been a bit of a generalist because I love collaboration. Mm-hmm. And I love being from and of a place, that place being Kentucky, since it's where I grew up. And so I think I proceeded through my career understanding that it was okay and maybe even beneficial to just kind of do it my own way, which is to say, put out my music independently, to tour in places and in ways that felt good to me. Sometimes that was by bicycle, to write the music and albums that nurtured that kind of collaboration and mashing together musical styles and everything. And I think that all of that happened, kind of regardless of what instrument I was playing. And it just so happened that the instrument that I chose in public schools was cello. I loved the sounds that it made. I loved the fact that pretty much whatever I wanted to do sonically, that's always seemed to be able to make it on the cello. And yeah, it's just a really cool thing.
Was your path to the cello, did you have any kind of role models with it, or was it all self-discovery?
Well, I mean, no role models here in Kentucky, at least not early on. I definitely discovered the Turtle Island String Quartet and loved the playing of Mark Summer. One of my first pieces that explored, like actually studying kind of jazz styles on the cello was his piece, which has become a rite of passage for cellists, Giulio. It's a really cool piece. I studied that with different teachers along the way just because I wanted to play a little bit like that. But I didn't have anybody to really teach me that path because it's just not the conventional path for a cellist. So there was one kind of avant-garde, eccentric cellist that was from Louisville, Michael Fitzpatrick, who has a nonprofit called Tuning the Planet. And he's the one who like brought in the Dalai Lama to record in Mammoth Cave and made this whole thing. I mean, he was a really great mentor for, I studied privately with him, but he's also a great mentor for just kind of, find your path and pursue it. And the only way that you can find it is going down it. So I definitely appreciate that.
So where did improvisation really enter into your practice as a young student?
I was always just messing around. It was part of the culture of the home that I lived in, right? Like neither of my parents were trained musicians, which I think is a little bit of a tricky word because they studied music. They listened to records, they transcribed, they learned by ear. My dad was a tremendous guitar player. And so it was just part of the house to sit down and make up stuff. I didn't call it improvisation, nor did my dad. It was just like you play a lead or you play rhythm or you play whatever. It's like the functionality of music. And so it was just kind of part of my makeup. And I would bump up against it a lot of times in orchestral environments because I would want to kind of express, emote, create what I was hearing versus what was on the page. And, that's where there was a lot of valuable lessons shared with me from my teachers, who helped me kind of begin the process of separating the craft of executing someone else's music versus the, artistry of creating it yourself. So anyways, the improvisation has always been part of my life. And it really wasn't until, late high school when I, took my first Jamie Abersol camp and, started kind of working in the books and everything. But even later in college, when I would play in jazz combos and stuff, that was where I started kind of doing the work of deepening my improvisational language. But otherwise, I was always just making stuff up.
How did that work when you went to college in terms of finding a place to balance these two sides of your playing?
Not particularly well. I think that I wasn't keen on going to college. I was already touring as a senior in high school. I was touring with different musicians around the country, and I didn't see a tremendous amount of value in going to school when I was kind of in the kind of the school of life out there on the road. But my parents and other folks in my life were like, you should do this now. It's not going to get easier to go to school later. So I think I ended up at the University of Louisville, partly because I love the city of Louisville, partly because they offered a generous scholarship for me to come. And also the cello teacher there, Professor Paul York, is a tremendous player. His school of bowing was kind of in line with where I was coming from, that kind of like Casals, that wonderful Italian, like flowing bow arm. So I was kind of already on my way, and Paul seemed like a good continuation of that, because I had been studying in Lexington with Benjamin Karp at the University of Kentucky, who's also tremendous. And, Paul, my teacher, and I, we really struggled. We battled a lot. We battled about technique. We battled about interpretation. We battled about literature and where I should be spending my time. He pushed me to play what he called legitimate music. And I was really interested in, sure, I'm really interested in studying the Lutoslawski cello concerto, but I'm also really interested in playing with that jazz combo and really working up those tunes and writing my own music.
Paul's a wonderful guy, wonderful player. I got to play with him a few times when I was in town, and a guy with some pretty firm opinions for sure. But I'm really curious about how. So you're a young guy, and you've been exposed to the very peak of Americana. You said over 200 shows.
Yep.
You get to school a little skeptical of what you're going to learn. But was there a moment in that where you thought, oh, like there is a world here of technique or music making that I hadn't considered, and that it ended up being of long lasting value for you to have gone through that process?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it was probably my sophomore year when I'd been preparing a couple bigger pieces. I don't recall what they were, but there was an opportunity to go to Poland to study with a sister school there in Katowice. And I remember just kind of being overwhelmed by it. I was still traveling back and forth to Lexington a lot. I was still touring about 5 weeks a semester. And I remember just kind of saying to Professor York, I said something about like, oh, it's all a lot. It's a lot. And he's like, well, I could find somebody else. And I think I realized at that moment that, where I was sitting was a place of opportunity. Mm-hmm. What Paul was teaching with me and demanding of me was a place of opportunity. And there wasn't this need to be skeptical or judgy about it now. Just learn the stuff and, kind of in that Bruce Lee sort of way, take what's beneficial, leave behind what's not helping you, and kind of innovate the rest or develop the rest to, make it work for you. So somewhere along there, and certainly my classical training has benefited, me, especially when it comes to being able to be multilingual, or at least multi-vernacular, right? So I can stand in front of an orchestra and be able to give, notes in a language that the orchestra is familiar with. But I can also work with a DJ and a hip hop artist and work with them on sample-based music. And then I can also turn around and be able to work with an R&B or a bluegrass band. And I feel like that, for me, was the part of studying classical music that I've benefited from the most, is being able to speak that language and be able to reference that, huge part of Western music history.
One thing that we talk a lot about in classical music is how we've lost in our tradition improvising as a staple of the practice. And it's been gone for, centuries now. And what are we talking, as we talk about reintroducing it, I wonder if you could put your finger on how your interpretation, like your interpretive skills, might be influenced by your background in improvisation. In other words, how do you think you play classical music or composed music a little differently than you would if you didn't, or if you weren't steeped in this vernacular music background?
I think I would have to have a little bit of an ability to stand outside myself to recognize that. And I'm not sure that I'd be able to tell you what would be different were I not who I am. Because unlike some of my other contemporaries that I've worked with, like Dave Eggar, or some of these other like cellists that grew up like heavy classical chops, like, young prodigies just out there doing it and then took a left turn or a right turn, or just threw their hands up and said, this is not for me. I never was that. I was always this kind of like super curious kid from Kentucky who played cello and guitar and all these other places. But I do think it's true that being steeped in all the traditions that I have been steeped in, and especially in folk music, certainly helped me be attracted to certain composers. I love Bartok's music. Like, please, all day long, give me those folk tunes. And I certainly appreciate the music that is more rhythmic, and am very attracted to that. And anything that has a kind of a groove to it in orchestras. Like we played in college, we played a Greek composer, Karol Husa. Is that it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in college, we played a work by Karol Husa. It's got this, it's all this mixed meter, stuff. And I just ate that stuff up. And so, a lot of the music that I was attracted to was influenced by where I was coming from, but also the way I interpreted that music. I'm not a big fan of liberal vibrato, because that's the soul, R&B, and folk vocalists that I grew up with. That's not how they sounded. That's not the sounds that I had in my ears. And, when it comes to kind of like bouncy bow spiccato techniques and stuff like that, I was never super attracted to that. Worked on the techniques, but I would tend to be more of a broad stroke kind of player, because that sounded better to me under my ear. And I always struggled with what that technique that full-time classical players know so well, which is like, what does it sound like, out in the hall? How do I get my instrument sounding like it out there? So
it's funny you bring that up. When I was in the Louisville Orchestra, one of the ways that we were trying to distinguish a sound was to purge ourselves of the constant vibrato use. And it's not a part of American music, generally speaking, that bel canto approach to vibrato that's kind of permeated all the string playing. I'm curious, though, do you think that if we added improvisation back into the standard curriculum of educating classical students, it just is one piece of the puzzle. I wonder, from what you're saying, do you think the thing that we might see the most improvement on is rhythm? I mean, because you see it whenever an orchestra approaches like highly rhythmic music, that's where things start to fall apart more often than not. And so rather than being able to, play a blistering solo, blistering 12-bar solo, maybe the thing we would learn is actually a little bit more rhythmic fluency.
Yes. So I think that incorporating improvisation back into the kind of curriculum, or maybe more importantly, culture of classical music, would do a lot of things, including improve an orchestra's groove. Because that's really what we're talking about. I mean, I think any member of the Louisville Orchestra, and most every orchestra in the world, can technically prepare some rhythm. And get that going. And then an ensemble, you can work it out over time to be able to get that more accurate. But if you don't have that really solid foundation of groove, it feels like it's, what's the word? I still have a little brain fog from COVID. Tenuous. It doesn't feel like rooted and grounded and groovy. And I think that's where improvisation comes in, because you really can't learn to improvise a lead until you learn how to play rhythm. And so much of playing rhythm is being able to support the lead line. And so you start to see yourself less as a member of an orchestra, this kind of big systemic organ instrument, and more of as a member of a band. And you're playing a supporting role and you're switching roles and all that other stuff. I think it could be tremendously powerful. I will add, though, that one of the things that I think that many musicians, and classical musicians especially, are discovering now in the COVID times, where we're all having to be more agile and more flexible and stretch ourselves a little bit into how we use technology and how we allow technology to enter our lives and our performances. I grew up recording myself. And I don't think that's something that a lot of classical musicians tend to do, again, because it's just not part of the kind of culture or ethos of being a musician. But I mean, from, I don't know, early high school, I had my little digital audio workstation and tape machines down in the basement, recording myself and overdubbing myself and learning how the instrument worked in different ranges. And that has continued all the way through to, even today, recording myself and composing for film and TV. And so I think that played a really big role in understanding, rhythm and groove, arranging for my instruments and arranging for other instruments. There's just something about understanding your instrument in relationship to a microphone and recording it that has a huge impact on the way that I play. And yeah.
I want to ask you though, taking a quick step back, when you're coming up in in your household learning to play and in these more professional groups, is there like a progression, like an unspoken like curriculum, for lack of a better word, in American music, where you progress from playing rhythm and then you kind of earn the respect or the chops or whatever to play lead? I mean, is there a linear progression that you go through that's kind of understood in the culture there?
You know, maybe. I think every music scene and every family is different. You know, for me growing up, since I was playing an instrument that often wasn't around, you know, going to Renfrew Valley and playing fiddle tunes on my cello, or, you know, playing, you know, my cello with my dad's R&B band, or, you know, what have you. There just wasn't a clear path. I think that question elucidates is that there wasn't here in Kentucky a lot of good guidance. Like, there was David Bowling up at IU, but you know, by the time I was ready to study with him, his health had fallen, right? And there were obviously people in New York and LA and all that stuff, and that leads to a story, you know, from college that I can share if it's relevant. But yeah, here in Kentucky, there wasn't that kind of structure that supported someone like me, who was really curious about all this stuff and wanted to play in all these different styles. And I think I would have benefited, much like Bela Fleck, the great banjo player, did. There was no one that was kind of playing like he wanted to play. And once he learned all the repertoire of, you know, Earl Scruggs, what's next? And growing up in New York, he had no shortage of people to interact with and learn from. And then he eventually came to Kentucky to actually deepen his knowledge of bluegrass. You know, for me, it probably would have been beneficial to go to a community that had a little bit more structure on growing through that. Yeah.
When you were in school, in college, was composition a part of your studies there?
So at the University of Louisville, composition was not part of my bachelor's degree in cello performance. I certainly interacted with composers, especially young student composers. I was very involved in any new music festival and young composers. And so we were always making up wacky pieces with extended techniques and stuff like that. So I was definitely interested in it, but it wasn't part of my curriculum per se, nor was, you know, music business, nor was recording arts or promotion and marketing. A lot of things that are absolutely essential to being a working musician were absent from my degree.
How did that work then? Was there tension between when you were in school? You said you were already touring as a senior in high school. Presumably you were still working when you were an undergrad. Was there like an institutional conflict between that you had a professional life outside of the school and then the lack of this kind of support for it in school?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of like being aware of the Matrix, right? You know, like I could see I would be in school kind of like deep in the institutional conventions of studying there, which, you know, are wonderful, especially if you don't have a good guide or idea of what you want to do. All of those rungs and ladders and paths and directions and buttons are all really, really key to guiding, you know, someone who wants to deepen their knowledge. But for me, I was also traveling out on the road. So, you know, a lot of times the definitive statements my teachers were making about harmony or, you know, the use of vibrato or, you know, you name it, I would go out on the road and all of those conventions were being broken, changed, amended, or just not timely. They just weren't being used at all. And so then I would come back to school with that knowledge, having just sat down and played with a bunch of Brazilian musicians playing choro music. And then I come back and we're working on, you know, like some Villalobos, you know, kind of dances or something like that. And it's like, this doesn't feel right at all. So yes, there was definitely that tension, which I think benefited me. It helped me understand where the boundaries were, and I could kind of see those structures and how they could benefit me, but also how they were restraining some of us.
Mm-hmm. Talk to me about getting into composing for soundtracks and documentaries. How did that get started? And was that something that you sought out, or did they find you? Particularly because so much of the work you've done has like this nature theme to it, or at least people in nature. I'm sure that's not a coincidence. And I'm just curious about how all this led up to where we are with this recent release of Land.
As you mentioned earlier on, I have long incorporated social and environmental advocacy, if not activism, into my music. I feel like it's important to use your platform as a musician to help educate and grow affection for various issues that humans are facing. And so through that work, you meet and kind of go into the trenches with other people that also care about the environment or health and safety in cities for bicyclists, you name it. And so the first films that I provided music for, scored, were really kind of came to me because I cared about the issue. So, they were documentaries about protecting, stopping mountaintop removal or protecting, Appalachia. There were documentaries about, people that were out in nature trying to, deepen their awareness of the earth and so on. And through that process, I worked with a lot of people that also cared deeply for these issues. And they grew up and started working with more people, and those people, and they kind of brought me along with them. And, eventually, after many years of making music, you find yourself kind of part of a big network of people that are making bigger and bigger works, which eventually led to me scoring Robin Wright's directorial debut, Land. And, that came about because, Robin had evidently, somebody had given her a mixtape with my music on it years ago. And so she had a deep affection for that. And then the music supervisor on it had worked, with some of my music as an edit on a TV show, and all that stuff just kind of led up to this moment in time. And, through that networking time, I was also building my skills of being able to, record and sequence with MIDI and all these other things that were not part of my skill set before because I wrote songs and played cello.
How did the collaboration with Time for Three come about for this one?
Robin Wright, the director, had been to a concert with Time for Three playing in a crypt in New York. Anyways, all I know, it was a very resonant, long tail reverb sort of environment, and she had just fallen in love with the way that made her feel, and kind of talked to the musicians, Nick and Renan and Charles, about being involved in the movie Land. And so when we started on the process, I was hired as the composer on the film to write the music that then Time for Three would arrange for their ensemble, and that's how it was going to go. But, as we explored things more and more, the guys were really interested in composing for a film. They'd never composed for film before. And Robin was really interested in having them more involved. So we just, even though we couldn't be together because it's pandemic and all this is happening over Zoom, we just kind of decided, hey, we're going to team up on this and collaboratively compose for the movie. And that's typically a recipe for trouble. As your listeners have probably, worked with, collaborated with, other composers or other kind of artistic personalities. Sometimes, many times actually, sadly, it doesn't work. The operational dynamics of it just kind of start spinning things and you just kind of lose control. But we were able to manage it, and I think ended up with a nice film score. But certainly a lot of the tools that I had learned working with my environmental and social organizations about personalities and making sure to listen and share ideas, and a lot of that other kind of stuff that I've learned from that corporate entrepreneurial world that I'm also involved with really helped facilitate making this record in a pandemic.
I would imagine that in normal times, a lot of this material would have been generated in playing together in the same room and just kind of working this stuff out. Obviously, it sounds like you kind of wrote the source material for it. How did you guys like make it happen when you can't play together? I'm just curious about how like 4 people in over imperfect streaming, video conferencing, were able to collaborate and make something so cohesive and beautiful.
That's a good question. We tried a couple different ways of collaborating in the cloud or with different tools online, but we ended up settling on just kind of working individually and then sending files back and forth on Dropbox. And that just meant keeping track of versions and making sure to listen to everybody's ideas. That was really key, to not just like look at a file or click on a file, listen to a little bit of it, but really listening for, what can we pull out of that piece, or what can we pull out of this piece to make something great. So that's how we did it. And then when it came time to kind of produce the final recordings for the movie, the guys, Time for Three, they felt comfortable getting together in a studio in New York. And so I supervised that session to try to keep everybody on time because those studios are expensive. And they recorded a lot of parts there. Then everything else was done in home studios.
Do you think that this has just opened a new door? Obviously, when things return to normal, people want to play together. But do you think in terms of like creating more music, creating more content, this has forced you guys to, not just you guys, but has it forced just artists in general to think, adopt technologies that we'll be able to use going forward?
Not only do I feel like it's opened people up individually to, using technology that's really been around for quite a while, but it kind of forced us to go ahead and adopt that and jump into the future, which I think, while painful right now, probably will be really beneficial down the line. I think that from an industry standpoint, it's opened everybody up. I mean, people are making movies with actors in separate places. So you can imagine what they're going to start doing with music, although it is really challenging to sync up audio for people performing together. But beyond that technical challenge, you can kind of see where this is all heading. So as a relatively young composer, being in Kentucky wouldn't have really been a realistic option for working in the industry. But I think that the pandemic has really kind of opened things up. In fact, to be honest, I kind of stepped away from being a full-time performing musician. After the, election of Donald Trump, many of the environmental and social agendas that I had worked so diligently on for years, racing around the world, playing shows and stuff, just got ripped up and thrown away. And that was disheartening for me. I had also, after 17 years of touring and, working hard and trying to support the family, I think I'd burn out a little bit. And so I came off the road. I took a job as a storyteller at a marketing agency, helping produce videos and write scripts. And that led to working with a nonprofit called Canopy, which allowed me to learn more about the entrepreneurial community. And so when the pandemic hit, I was already in a place where I'd kind of transitioned. And I was not hit as hard as some of my other musician friends that were full-time road musicians. There was a little bit of survivor's guilt involved there, but I was also able to help them find gigs and do cool stuff, and that felt really good. But now that the pandemic has hit and everything has kind of changed, the cards have been shuffled, I'm feeling much more hopeful about making a career in music again.
Because it's not so place-based or road-based?
It's not so place-based. Many of the people that were part of the music industry because it was easy, or because they had found a path where they could easily make some money. In this way, I'm thinking of, quite a few electronic musicians, maybe some of the up and coming kind of country music talent, where there was a lot of money in the industry. They've kind of cleared out because when it came right down to it, without all the tools of a stage show, right? Like without the front of house engineer running tracks and making sure that the auto tune is dialed in, without the lighting designer like flashing the audience, and without all the kind of flash, when you're interacting with your audience in your home on a laptop computer camera, musicianship matters. The ability to comfortably and authentically create a piece of music and share that and perform for folks out there in the world, and help them feel something over that distance. It takes real musicianship and real storytelling ability. And if you have a deficit in those places, it shows really quickly. And so I think that as an artist who was very earnest and authentic, and I just wanted to collaborate and play and connect with audiences, it actually benefited me tremendously to be able to flip on my cam and have people home ready and willing and open to some type of emotional musical experience. And so I think that we're heading to a place where, or the pendulum has swung back to a place where people appreciate real artistry. And I know that sounds pretentious, but when I say real artistry, I mean like, people who've put in the time to develop those skills to a level where it's really comfortable and natural and authentic. And people appreciate, kind of that real connection, because now we've been deprived of it, right? Where once escapism was so important because we were constantly interacting with people, now we're like, oh, please give us that interaction.
That's really interesting, Ben. Do you think so? I think there's going to be like a certain, what I've been calling a honeymoon period, where there'll be some kind of pent up demand for live events or any kind of events in the coming months, hopefully.
Right.
But I've been worried that will probably tail off fairly quickly.
Interesting.
If that prediction does come true, and how do you think that the music business will look, let's say, a year from now? Do you think we get back to like 2019 levels of touring and people putting out records, or do you foresee like a whole new like tangled web of live performances via the internet, or and I also want to ask you about, how does streaming come into all this in terms of, like, I know there's a big demand on artists to put out more and more music because the algorithms reward that. I mean, did we reach kind of a saturation point in 2019 where there was probably maybe too many people on the road, maybe putting out too much stuff, and then maybe 2022 we see like reaching a new equilibrium where people that have audiences that they can reach online are finding a part of that like longer tail?
It's a good question. I think the music business is currently settling into a new equilibrium, and I think that for the next 2 to 3 years we're going to be in a very hybrid place, where we will continue to see online and increasingly interactive shows, performances, events, where you will have some audience in person and some audience remote. And I think that's going to change how people compose their music. And once that happens, then it becomes part of the scores and the written performance pieces. And so then we'll find ourselves increasingly in a place where that's an expectation of the audience. And while that's really cool and all, it does definitely mean very different things. Like, instead of preparing a show and performing that 3 times for different audiences, now each show is going to have an element to it that needs to be a little bit different, a little bit unique, a little bit, an experiential factor that has been, part and parcel of theater for a long time, or even comedy, right? Like comedians had to deal with this long ago. Like they'd work up these skits and then it would be on a TV and then everybody would know the punchlines of their jokes. So we're going to have to deal a little bit with that now as musicians. We're not going to be able to walk up and, play the same set. And certainly for classical musicians, it's an extra thing because there's not the spontaneity in those shows typically that is a part of, Americana or country music or some of the shows that incorporate improvisational music. So I think we're going to be in a hybrid model for a while. And the question for me is going to be, once that's established, does it become an expectation of the customers, the audience, the people that buy tickets? And if that's so, then we're all going to really deepen our knowledge of how to incorporate technology into our music. And I think that that's really exciting, but I could see how for some people it could be quite overwhelming. Because where this is all heading is maybe a place that is a touch unsustainable. And I don't mean that in like a bad way. I mean, like, it's kind of like learning how to be a good spouse. You can't be all things that your partner needs all the time. And being a good, effective, profitable musician, you can't be the artist, recording engineer, manager, booker, promoter, artist. Like, it's just not sustainable. Not only is it not, like, it's also not very compelling, to your to fans and patrons. They're like, ooh, I just want you to like, can you just play pretty music? I don't want you to sell me anything right now. Like, so trying to find that balance point, that to me on an individual level is going to be really an important thing to continue to experiment with and tweak.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Are you surprised by how much interactive content an artist can put out and not like oversaturate their fans? I mean, because I remember talking to you years and years ago about timing tours through cities and having to put so many months in between them. If you're showing up at somebody's computer every Tuesday or something, like, has that kind of been upended? Like your assumptions about how what audiences want from you?
Yeah, for me and a lot of other artists. I mean, you just like, first of all, it helps you realize that while the material is important, the interaction is as, if not more important, right? So like that sharing of things for many artists. Like there's some artists that are, maybe more avant-garde that are trying to push the boundaries of a particular field. Like that's maybe a separate conversation, but like people who have an audience or are developing an audience, much like publishers figured out a long time ago, consistency is really important. And once you achieve that consistency, then there's a certain level of trust where you can experiment, you can repeat, and it's like finding that secret sauce depending on your audience that is really helpful. But I will say that it is becoming true and will continue to rapidly become more true that it's not enough to just be a fantastic musician. It's not enough to be a good performer. You really have to have a mission. It's important to have a mission and to communicate that with your audience, because much like we're seeing right now with corporations and businesses, not-profit organizations, that are responding to racial injustice, kind of the essential worker conversation and at-risk communities, education, health and safety. You have to, these consumers are holding these companies accountable. Like when a company says that they're, they have your best interests in mind, but then they're treating their employees really poorly, the employees live in the community with you too. So as artists, I think that it's going to become real important to identify, communicate, and really drive impact around your mission. For me, my personal mission is to create experiences that grow a greater sense of togetherness. And that's a unifying mission for me, whether I'm working on putting together a live event with Kentucky Performing Arts, or whether I'm developing a virtual reality music app. How is that contributing to a greater sense of togetherness? And, that helps me connect with my audience. It helps me identify corporate partners to help sponsor and partner on producing more content. It helps me vet advertisers and other folks that I'm going to work with and take money from. It's something that has existed in the business community for a while around the conscious capital movement. It is absolutely essential of being an entrepreneur today. Like, if you're going to start a business, you have to have not just a mission, but like an impact campaign that's like operationalized within your company, right? Mm-hmm. And as artists, we often we get pulled in to help with that stuff, but we never think about it for ourselves as entrepreneurs ourselves. And so I think that's going to be a really crucial shift that I would encourage your listeners to consider. And there's lots of resources for how to write your personal mission statement. Definitely, that's going to be crucial for growing and developing, because your audience wants to know what you're into, because they can consume your catalog. I don't know, like with my catalog, they could probably consume it in an afternoon if they really wanted to. So what's next? Mm-hmm. What's after that?
Ben, let me ask you, how do you then see institutional music makers like orchestras or university or music schools or conservatories that probably incorrectly see themselves as somewhat neutral territory, but like it's a difficult conversation for an organization that perhaps prides itself to a degree on being apolitical? How does an organization like that move into those waters and not like step on a third rail?
There's just not an option anymore. In the global environment that we find ourselves in, it's not an option to not take a side. Mm-hmm. You can't not have a values forward organization, program, institution, whatever. Mm-hmm. It has to be values forward, because if not, you're not standing on anything. And when the audience finds out, or when the employees are feeling unsupported, or like their voices aren't being heard, that will cause a problem. And so, schools are discovering this by, supporting students and then teachers during this time, and that being something that drives their decisions around safety and health. Certainly, orchestras and institutions have struggled to appropriately support their artists in the past, and that has usually manifested in disputes, right? Mm-hmm. Very public disputes that take a very short time to ignite and a long time to extinguish.
Well put.
As you well know. And it's just not worth the cost, right? Mm-hmm. It's too costly for an organization to have to rebuild after something ignites. So the best thing to do is actually what we should be doing, which is like showing our employees, whether that's in an orchestra, the artist and the staff, or in a company that's a janitorial service that's, got folks cleaning toilets, like, you got to take care of them, mm-hmm. right? You got to take care of their health, mental, physical. You got to make sure that they have stability in their lives, because once they have stability, then that's when they can really grow.
What are your thoughts on beyond programming? So, most of the orchestras that are lucky enough to still be up and working, which is quite frankly most of us at a certain level, have changed their programming. But I also wonder, like, what do you think about bringing in voices, like non-musical voices, for instance, to address these issues more head on with internally, but externally too? Because classical music, abstract music, textless music, wordless music can only get so political. Do you think that there's room within an organization like a symphony orchestra to bring in guest speakers or to put on productions that are overtly political?
Do I think that there's room for it? Yes. Do I think it's necessary? No. I think that it's more important to lift up the voices of your institution. I think it's more important to support artists in the organization or the orchestra that are transgender, or maybe they're transitioning, and making sure that that is understood and feels good within the community, right? And dealing with it when members of the organization, orchestra, don't do that well or don't live up to your values, or if there is a representation problem in the organization, orchestra, talking about that, being transparent about it, saying like, well, it looks like actually we're paying the guys in our orchestra a lot more than we're paying the gals. Or
well, we solved that problem by being union, right? So that's one of the wonderful benefits of unionization, is that gender parity or gender pay gets kind of ironed out.
Certainly for the players and the artists, but not always so for the administration, right?
True. That's an excellent point.
So unionization can help with that stuff as long as it's being transparent within the union as well, right? So really, really key, transparency.
So
those are just some of the examples, but I think bringing in an outside voice is not as powerful as supporting your employees.
And that's what you mean by values forward, in the sense that if you really look inside, and people take notice because your actions speak loudly.
Yeah, I mean, look at what's happening with Google right now, right? Like, their employees are having to unionize. Google wasn't supporting them and wasn't respecting their lives, and their quality of life wasn't there. I mean, sure, they were being paid, but it's not the same. And Google wasn't being transparent, and wasn't being equitable, and representation was a problem. And like, all of those things are just, you can see them as like, they're on the horizon line right now, but the speed with which we're all approaching that place of a reputation economy is going to be here for all of us a lot sooner than we think, and maybe for some of us sooner than we would like, because we haven't put the time in on our reputation and built trust between our cohorts and our employers and our other employees and other artists in the community. Because at the end of the day, that's what it's about, is trust. And that, I think, is where the real deep opportunity for the arts is. Because when you zoom out from the pandemic, we're looking at an incredibly unstable decade. Next 2 decades are going to be really, really intense. We're talking about resources being really tight. We're talking about climate change. We're talking about kind of continued trying to find some type of equity and buoyancy with the digital revolution, and kind of mechanization of a lot of jobs, including artistic jobs. We should not overlook the power of some of this machine learning in the arts. It's going to have a huge impact when a company, instead of licensing a catalog of music to play in their stores 24/7, now they're going to hire an algorithm to produce music that they like, that they're going to own, right? Like, it's going to have a huge impact on our careers. So this disruption, we have to really consider, like, how are we going to handle that? And while data and science and companies are all really, really important for being able to kind of wrap our brains around these issues, we really need the arts, music, dance, poetry, visual arts, to help wrap our hearts around these issues. And that's why my personal mission is togetherness. Because if we constantly feel like we're pulled apart and finding ways to say, like, well, that's your problem and this is my problem, and they're competing, we're not going to be able to really deal with some of these really, really big issues that we are facing, not that we're going to face. And the arts have a really special ability to grow affection. And by affection, I don't mean like love, hugs, kisses. I mean like intimate knowledge of something, intimate knowledge of the farmland in Kentucky, intimate knowledge of the West End of Louisville's heritage with jazz music, the intimate knowledge of, being a craftsmanship, a craftsman, and really knowing the woods that are in your backyard, like that sort of intimate knowledge of place. And that's why I'm still here in Kentucky, because I want to grow affection for many of the issues that we're facing here, which are represented around the country and world. And I want to do it from a place. I mean, place-based music is becoming more and more rare as the world globalizes. And that's why I have stayed in Kentucky. That's why I will continue to stay in Kentucky, because I want to make music, art, and experiences from and of this place.
Is there a friction between the togetherness and choosing a side?
Tell me more.
Well, you said, I'm kind of going back a little bit to the idea of neutrality. And again, I use that sort of neutrality in air quotes.
Right.
But you said a little earlier that you are talking about you want togetherness. And I had a similar metamorphosis, I guess, or evolution in my thinking about my role after the 2016 election. The music thing became much on the back burner. The institutional purpose is community building.
Yep.
At some point, though, it seems like that comes into friction with a political schism in our culture. And if an organization chooses a side, or an artist chooses a side, there's some degree of alienation from a certain segment of your state or your commonwealth.
It's the kind of advice that the manager gives the artist, like, don't get too political or you'll piss off your audience. Yeah, I think that's a reality. Certainly, for the leadership of the orchestra and certainly the development office of the orchestra, it is absolutely crucial that you be as inclusive as you can of the community that wants to patronize the arts. That's true. At the same time, it is also true that the economy of the arts that exists today, that being the people who buy tickets and donate to organizations like the Louisville Orchestra or really any other organization, is changing. That demographic is changing fast. And the demographic that's funding these organizations is looking around and they're trying to see what they can support that aligns with their values. And the only way for that to be a good fit for arts organizations and the patrons that support those is if the organization is very clear about what it cares about and executing that. Obviously, there's some basic things that you got to do, from a diversity, equity, inclusion standpoint, transparent leadership, pay equity, all that stuff. You got to deal with that stuff to stabilize. But then beyond that, starting to think about what is the need in our community, what's the problem we're trying to solve as an organization. Certainly in Louisville, we have a real representation problem on our stages. And certainly Teddy and members of the orchestra like yourself have really worked to improve that. So letting that be, front and center, we're an orchestra that's trying to, pave the way, push, show our values around, representation in our community. Not just representation, but leadership in our community. That's going to benefit you in the long run. The orchestra can't afford to not live up to those values because that's where things are going. And that conversation is a tough one. But that's where good, steady guidance from people that have been through from people that have already been through the kind of the battle that is that, these are people that have led companies that have been through terrible PR campaigns where they've been just, absolutely crucified, sometimes for really good reason, and managed to come out on the other end. That's where the guidance of those folks comes in really handy, because they can say, don't wait for you to get called out on this. It's the right thing to do. Let's do it now. Let's support our community. And I feel like I've mistakenly focused too much on the Louisville Orchestra in this conversation. I really want to just broaden out, like, arts organizations have often had missions around what they do, like teaching arts in the community, or, commissioning new works and, all that other stuff. But at the end of the day, like, we're talking about something more, because we're trying to build trust in our communities. And you can make the best crazy art. You can play the most technical pieces. You could commission some of the wildest new works and still not be supporting your community and not being equitable about it and not representing your community's needs. And so that kind of like hyper local focus with some vision to it, I think, is where arts are going. And that's why I say you gotta take a side, because I don't feel like it's a battle. I just feel like there is a knowledge and data and kind of a gut level knowing that if we're going to take care of humans and do it fairly and equitably, there's really only like one North Star that heads that way. And representing that and keeping that in your sight line while we all navigate the very challenging task of making a career in the arts is challenging. There's no doubt about it, but there's really no way around it.
Well, Ben, I think this is a pretty good place to wrap up. I appreciate your making time.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you for listening. The music on the show, as always, is by Craig Wagner, a virtuoso guitarist from Louisville, Kentucky. We'll be back soon with more interviews, so please go ahead and hit subscribe.